And joining us in studio is Professor Barry Hanyane, a political analyst. Leon Low is Executive Director for Free Market Foundation. Masana Dingangaka is a senior researcher at the Center for the Study of Violence and Reconciliation. And to all our guests, thanks so much for making it, sacrificing your public holiday to be here. But maybe just to ask in the public discourse whether Reconciliation Day is a universal theme that all South Africans embrace. We'll start with you, Masana.
Thank you so much. I definitely feel that there's been an increasing sense of disarray around the reconciliation narrative over the past few years. The must-fall movements indicate really a fracture within the social contract in South Africa, where political legitimacy and the delivery of services serve to undermine the narrative of reconciliation that was positioned so aptly in 1994 to bring in democracy. But whether or not democracy has been able to deliver on its promises has made that reconciliation is almost like a catch-all phrase for everything and anything that the state can use to pacify people.
Yeah, almost like a pipe dream deferred. Barry, what is your sense?
No, absolutely. I would concur with the sentiment here expressed. I think we are experiencing, on the other hand, an assault on the democratic project itself, political and otherwise. We're still dealing with the ugly face of racism. And then, of course, from an economic point of view, your divide between the haves and the have-nots. We still have issues around service delivery and the protest that has characterized the demand for a better life for all in that respect. So yes, there is a rhetoric that we need to reconcile, but real issues remain a serious challenge for all and sundry, from government to NGOs to the ordinary man in the street as well.
Yeah, but are these symptoms that are endemic with a young democracy, in the sense that we've come from this bitter past of 300 years of colonialism, apartheid and slavery, etc., that it is almost naive to expect that things will be hunky-dory, as it were, Leon?
Yes, I think there are various narratives, and one of them is the naive one that there can be something we call reconciliation, where everyone sings Kumbaya and lives happily ever after. The real world is that there are tensions, and the real world is that some people experience more hostility, less reconciliation than others. I tend to be an optimist, I always have been, and I see a lot of good. I see more than perhaps the two colleagues on this panel. I personally, for example, I'm wearing a T-shirt that is about the Alex Property Owners Association. I work happily with black people in black communities, trying to fight, for example, for the rights of street traders and for the rights of people who haven't got their property back 20 years after apartheid ended. And I've personally never experienced any of this hostility that everyone else seems to experience, but I do think what's important here is there's a self-serving narrative. Politicians, and I'm afraid activists and many journalists, like to create the belief that there is more tension. They feed on it, they feast on it. Whereas the reality on the ground, I think, may be less dramatic than they like to pretend, for all sorts of self-serving and ideological reasons.
Masana, do you think it is a selective perspective that we have, depending on which side of the fence you are, or based on the color of your complexion?
Well, I mean, just even Barry's perspective, or Leon's perspective himself, being his race and his gender, working in townships, needs to also go into those situations and circumstances, understanding his relative privilege and his relative identity narratives that position him in a place where perhaps there are some power dynamics that he's not aware of. And this is not to discount that there are wonderful, happy stories taking place across the country, but the reality is that even where there may be low-scale tensions and conflicts, the structural violence of apartheid and the fault lines that lead to physical violence ultimately mean that reconciliation, as it stands, isn't serving the purposes for a sustainable social contract.
Your view, Leon?
Yes, I'm not sure on what account Masana thinks my gender and my color are relevant to my thoughts, and I want to assure you that I never use my genitals or my skin when I think. I think with my head and I observe with my eyes. And I observe a world, for example, in which I can go and meet with the street vendors of Johannesburg who are driven off the streets by a largely black city council, and I'm talking about before the present one, which is still, as far as I can tell, largely black, I consider that irrelevant. What I do consider relevant is that under apartheid and after apartheid, ordinary human beings are being treated like garbage, truly like garbage. The city council clears away street vendors with the cleansing department. That's the department that cleans away litter, cleans away human beings. And who took the city council to court to get them the right to return to the streets? That was them and me. At no stage did I think anybody consider skin color or gender of relevance. We considered human beings of relevance.
But surely there is a denialism of the white privilege, and often when we talk about monopoly capital, for example, old money still lies within white hands. It's almost perceived as if you attacking the person or their character, as opposed to it largely being a national debate that we need to have, that we're not in that egalitarian society we ought to be. Not everybody, and predominantly the black majority, are not sharing in the prosperity and the wealth of this country, and that's the reality.
Well, that's the political narrative. It is not what the data, the objective facts and data show. And that's the problem. The problem is the political narrative is to generate this perception. But where are the facts, the actual data? Let me give you one simple fact. Most of the stock exchange of South Africa, the biggest single investor, is not monopoly capital. It's not monopoly capital of a particular race. It is the ordinary people through the PIC, the Public Investment Corporation, which is something like 98% black people, is the biggest single owner of equity on the Johannesburg Stock Exchange. The stock exchange itself is less than 15% of the GDP. The majority of the South African economy is ordinary people, plumbers and architects and doctors and taxi owners and
I think Masana's got a counter-argument to that, Leon.
Well, she might have, but then she must tell me what her sources are. I can give you the actual data, the facts, the objective published data. Okay. So if I'm wrong, what are your data?
Great. I mean, let's talk about urban spaces then. Predominantly in urban spaces in the major capital cities. What is the demographics of people living in suburbs and the demographics of people living on the periphery?
Well, the number is published. They're currently more than... Obviously, the race card is going to be played in this discussion.
Okay, so let me stop you there.
No, it's not even that. We're just trying to reflect on what is going on in the space we live in.
I'm uncomfortable with this endless obsession with race, but I'll play that card.
But it's easy for you to be uncomfortable to say it's a race card.
You're making assumptions about where I live and how I live, and you have no knowledge.
I'm not actually making assumptions about where you...
But let's look at the facts. The facts are that more than 50% of all purchases of freehold land in historically white areas that we call suburbs, more than half of the land purchases are black South Africans. 6 million black South Africans are now in what is called in economics, more than 12,000 rand a month, the middle class. That's more than the total number of white South Africans. So if more than half of all the land in what we call suburbs is being purchased by black people, then this is a wonderful piece of information.
Yeah, as optimistic,
we should celebrate it.
Sure, as optimistic as I am, and also quick to acknowledge that there has been great strides made in the past 22 years. Living as a black woman in being indigenous to this country, it's extremely difficult to even access those opportunities or property in suburbia based on your background. The fact that there wasn't a job reservations for your parents, even if you were a common clerk, you'd know in then apartheid, you would be given property that is of value, that at least has a garden or even a swimming pool for that matter. There is the stereotype as well where people will say black people don't swim, and it becomes a big joke. It's because your 4-roomed house, the matchbox that you lived in, only had enough space for a washing line. So, if we continue to deny what the failed black aspirations are, by then saying, it becomes a race card, I'm uncomfortable, it doesn't take us anywhere in wanting to get to that point of a rainbow nation.
Oh, yes, and so what must we do about it? Well, one of the things is start by turning all of these properties into full freehold title, which is what I spend my time working for.
Yeah, but I also think that we need to acknowledge that the symptoms of apartheid are still very visible.
Yes, and they probably will be for 100 years.
So how do we then take this discussion
forward? We do
as
best we can. Now, the very best thing you can do is high rates of economic growth. You cannot redistribute wealth if there isn't any to redistribute. So what you want to do is you want to make the country rich. Let me give you a simple statistic. If we had grown at 7% since 94, we would now be 4 times the GDP we've got. At 7%, wealth doubles every 10 years. The country would be 4 times wealthier. How much of that wealth would be in the different hands of different races and genders and age groups is a matter we can certainly discuss. But the first thing you've got to do is be rich. Then you can have services and you can have good education and good schools and free universities and cheap data and everything else. So start by becoming rich.
And how do we become rich based on the history that we have as a people?
Do you want to take that?
I'll leave that to the economists, but that's a bit contentious, eh? Lessons learned from the Asian countries don't perhaps support that argument or have gone through that particular historical path. What I think is important is to make sure, and from a political point of view, our government work. Yes, we need to create jobs. And let's distinguish between living a comfortable life and from that of generating wealth to the point of saying we need to be rich. That for me it's a little bit uncomfortable.
Yeah, but I mean, there's also, what was it, 600 million or so that is in the hand of corporate South Africa and that they're withholding because of, be it the sentiment of political stability, where the country is going, the next leadership or administration. And the reliance on government is also very skewed in creating the jobs and turning the economy around. If there are pockets of people that are sitting on essentially financial injection that the economy needs.
Well, I mean, just on that, I think, again, there's also conflation of what wealth, GDP wealth specifically, can and cannot do. I mean, you look at the Asian countries, their human rights track records are appalling. And there are some economists who believe that human rights agendas and GDP growth are incompatible. So the deplorable working conditions of the masses faced in a number of Asian countries, in the factories and the workshops where the hours are ridiculous and the pay is really low, that's the cost of high GDP growth. And I think there is almost a sense in which South Africans collectively need to reflect on the political settlement that we entered into in 1994 and the falling of trade barriers and the undercutting of our textile industry and the opening of our, I mean, you're from the Free Market Foundation, you should know, I mean, how really a number of working class South Africans were put out of jobs to compete in an international economy. And people tend also to say that, you know, the South African government itself, things were better under apartheid, but in this day and age, our government is unable to carry that. But apartheid was import substitution, industrialization, where the government intentionally closed off trade barriers and was able to develop industrialization because of the deplorable working conditions faced by the majority of black South Africans.
Yeah, let's talk about the concessions of 1994 and who it benefits largely in this day and age, notwithstanding the fact that we have rights and responsibilities that we enjoy due to the advent of democracy and people that have fought and given their lives, for you and I to just even have this conversation. But it doesn't benefit the majority black people who are still disenfranchised, who do not have access to quality education. We all flock to suburbia because of the amenities and, you know, just the livelihood that you have there. So who does the concessions still benefit today, just based on these statistics?
Well, I just want to be, you know, invite everybody please to check the statistics. What you've said, and this is normal, everyone repeats this meme, this refrain. The reality, the data that are available tell a very exciting story, and there's a very simple source of information. The presidency has published a thing called the 20-year review, which includes most of the data available from statistical services. And there you can see all sorts of interesting things. The number, for example, of students at private schools, the percentage who were black in 1994 were something like 5 or 6%. It is now 70%. Now, the private schools are a very small percentage of all the schools, so those are the elites. But what about ordinary government schools? In 1994, less than 50% of the teachers were qualified teachers. It's now something like 95%. I'm not saying they're great schools, but I am saying that what we need to do in South Africa is celebrate everywhere you look. The most important statistic of all is life expectancy. People are living longer. So everywhere you look, every piece of objective information, the number of cell phones, the number of cars, the clothing expenses, the per capita incomes, the square meters of housing, the access to motorized transport, the access to healthcare, no matter what statistic you look at, there has been a fantastic rate of transformation in South Africa, and if I may say, black advancement, which we shouldn't be surprised by. Anyone who says that there hasn't been transformation is basically saying something very bizarre, that the new South Africa is as bad as the crime against humanity, apartheid. Well, that's ridiculous. How can anyone start by saying that post-apartheid South Africa is as bad as Verwoerd South Africa for black people? It clearly is nonsense.
You know, having said that, there's also other stats in the United Nations. South Africa is regarded as the most unequal society in the world. The advancement that has been made, you cannot ignore. But reality is, if you look at per capita, what people earn, the quality of life they have, they may live longer, but I can assure you it's a miserable existence. That of deprivation, that of lack, that of absolute hopelessness. And this is the point where we need to, when we talk transformation, it's not necessarily just replacing black and white faces. It needs to deal with ownership, about equity, and that the next generation must not be perpetual tea girls and garden boys and that kind of thing. You know what I mean? So the level of education, the opportunities that are created must be of that kind of caliber.
Absolutely. And I think we need to actually take some pride as a country in what's been accomplished. I think this endless narrative that nothing has changed or the slow pace of change is an insult to firstly black South Africans who embraced their liberty in a most spectacular and heroic way and achieved a lot with it. It's an insult to those people. To, for example, Oscar, who I know is a carpet cleaner, who started a carpet cleaning business. He used to be a laborer. He now owns a company that employs 25 people and owns 3 vehicles. And he's a marvelous example of an enterprising, energetic, successful South African, regardless of race. What happened under apartheid, and I was old enough to live there, I was old enough to be in the SABC when I sat in a studio like this, the viewers can't see the rest of the studio, there was not one person of color. I'm now sitting in your studio and there is not one European person, not one white person I can see. Now, I'm not saying that's good or bad, I'm just saying to deny that accomplishment is a very strange thing for South Africans to do. I was part of the anti-apartheid movement. Not everything I dreamt of has happened, but at the same time, we really ought to celebrate what we have achieved, which is really not, which isn't nothing.
It's like you're almost thinking, okay, you have so many thoughts. But yes, we agree. We are celebrating, but also we can, you know, try and move forward.
For more.
Yes, the economic transformation or the second.
It's never enough.
I mean, but there's also, I mean, whilst we're celebrating, and to be honest, I'm a product of this new South Africa. I mean, I was born during apartheid, but I've definitely benefited from the new dispensation and black economic empowerment and affirmative action, and I sound the way I sound, and I went to former Model C schools. But right, when we talk about reconciliation and integration, the statistics show that it is the upper to middle income groups that are integrating. But the economic dynamics that existed under apartheid of maids and madams and bas and boys, that continues. And I mean, I don't mean to discredit your narrative and your reality. This is not a personal attack. It's not about you as a person or the important and meaningful contribution you're making to society. This is about trends and patterns. And yes, whilst there has been much done, there's still massive gross mal-expenditure at the municipal level. There's still increases in protests on service deliveries. There's still issues of land redistribution and inefficiencies in the state. And South Africans in the lower levels of our earning capacity are not integrating. And when we say reconciliation, South Africans are so quick to say, I'm proud of the flag, or I'm proud of the vuvuzela, you know, or I believe in Ubuntu. But when you look at the statistics from Afrobarometer, mind you, you're very big on statistics. The statistics show that South Africans are unlikely to trust people of other identity groups. So reconciliation, again, isn't even just about black and white and Indian and colored. It's also about those who are LGBTIQ and those who are not, those who are religious and those who are not. It's about different classes interacting. And I think this is really, the problem is that the fault lines on which our conflicts intersect as a society tend to be along racial fault lines. And those are magnified by other conflicts, and that's important to acknowledge, despite all of the great things that have been accomplished in society.
I couldn't
I
put
just
it
want to
better.
point out that rapidly the majority of madams are now black madams. You know, the idea that madams are necessarily white is actually a kind of a weird sort of, I don't know, it's a sort of illusion that people have. The reality is, I've just come to the studio from the Mall of Africa. Here are the wealthiest people of South Africa doing their Christmas shopping. I haven't got a statistic, but I would bet money on it that it's about 60% black South Africans in there. 20 years ago, there would be pretty much zero other than laborers.
All right, Barry, just closing comments as we finalize.
I wouldn't like to put mine forward, and I respect the fact that we're out of time, but I think from both of my colleagues there's something that I've learned today, and I think most South Africans have. One, it's important to celebrate the achievement that we've done, no doubt about that, but at the same time, the reality on the ground points to different perspectives that by and large calls on us to get our hands dirty and make sure that this country works.